Alright, welcome back. Here we are again. In our last video, we showcased just how deep the swamp of corruption penetrates into Racing Queensland and the greyhound racing industry, and how trainers complicit in that corruption can get away with the unprecedented exposure of killing dozens of greyhounds and still be allowed to race. Namely, we are talking about Bill Samuels and Narelle Mulcahy, who colluded with the GRA in setting up Doc Jamieson in a false inquiry in 2007, then were later busted for killing 55 greyhounds in 2015. They got off scot-free, no jail time, no racing ban, and ever since, they have continued racing greyhounds to this day. Just to recap, we're going to play a short segment from the intro of the previous video we released earlier in June. We told you that we were going to expose how, after being charged over the discovery of 55 greyhound carcasses, this trainer, Narelle Mulcahy, and her partner, Bill Samuels, escaped animal cruelty charges, jail time, and being banned for life from greyhound racing. Anyone else who did what they did would have gone down with at least this much. Investigators had the evidence, they had the crime scene, the carcasses, the shell casings, the perps, and the guns. So how did Bill and Narelle get away scot-free with one of the biggest cases of animal cruelty in Australian greyhound racing history? And how on earth are they still racing to this day? And they haven't just been racing recently. Bill and Narelle have been racing greyhounds for a very long time, probably since the 90s, maybe even before that, but certainly since the early 2000s, before Doc even began seriously racing greyhounds. And they've been racing all the way through to present day. This is the news footage we posted earlier this month. This was from April 2015.
They're not racing anymore. I've confirmed that with the stewards this morning.
That didn't age well, did it? This is another article of the same story in the following year, in 2016. Now, this is the Greyhound Recorder website, and this is Narelle Mulcahy's profile, and this is just the top 50 greyhounds by prize money. And if we go into the history of just some of these dogs, you can see that these trainers, ever since before, during, and after being charged over the discovery of the 55 dead greyhounds, these trainers have been racing still all the way through 2015, 2016. All the way through to now. This is 2021, 2022, 2023, this month. Here we are on the Racing Queensland website. We're at Bundaberg on Monday the 5th of June 2023. This is race 2. There's Narelle. She's just put her dog into box 1. She got the good boxes today. And there's a dog coming in 3rd place. That was Rhino Buster. Same day, race 10. There's Narelle again. She got the good box again, box 1. And there's her dog again, Dunworthy Lass, 1st place. So how's it possible that these trainers are still racing? Well, put simply, Bill and Narelle have a get-out-of-jail-free card. You see, in 2007, Bill and Narelle colluded with corrupted officials within the Greyhound Racing Authority, now known as Racing Queensland, to stitch up this man, Doc Jamieson, in a false inquiry designed to destroy his image, drag his name through the mud, and stop him from racing greyhounds. Okay, that's enough. I'm sure you get the picture, and just to rub it in a little more and show you just how well Racing Queensland are not only looking after these trainers by allowing them to continue racing, but also giving them the best chances of winning. Remember, there's race fixing going on in this industry. Here is Narelle again. Just yesterday, 26th of June, at the time of this recording, it's the 27th, she's just boxed her dog in green, the 6th dog, Midnight Prince, and here it is coming down to finish, almost winning 2nd place. It's good times when you've got Racing Queensland in your pocket. While the last video gave more of a broad overview, in this video we're going to begin breaking down in detail the nuance of the false inquiry conducted by the GRA, the Greyhound Racing Authority, and the plot surrounding it that saw Doc Jamieson punished for daring to play fair, standing up for animal welfare, and speaking only the truth. Since the handing down in 2007, Doc has been attempting to have his own inquiry opened for an investigation into the handling of the first inquiry to show how it was set up. But if this were allowed to happen and proceedings were handled impartially and fairly, not only would it be open and shut with Doc's exoneration and clearing of his name, it would also raise a host of questions into the integrity of Racing Queensland and open the floodgates for a litany of investigation and paving the way for a royal commission into the entire greyhound racing industry. And that's why Racing Queensland have continued to ignore Doc's repeated formally requesting an inquiry, and to this day they persist to sweep it all under the rug. Now, Doc has also submitted evidence to the Queensland Greyhound Racing Commission of Inquiry in 2015. That was the Alan McSparan inquiry, the Crime and Corruption Commission, racing ministers, the Attorney General, the Governor General, and many, many more, and the result has been the same every single time. This shows just how high up the corruption reaches from the depths of the swamp of corruption beneath greyhound racing all the way up through to the highest levels of government. Here, we'll be focusing on the first day of the inquiry, the hearing of the 3rd of July 2007, using the transcript record as our map. If you'd like to follow along, the transcript has already been made available on our website and can be downloaded through the link in the description below. We'll be detailing the conflicts of interest, the denial of natural justice, the absurdity of the allegations, the motives to frame Doc, and the lack of witness credibility before finally breaking down the transcript in detail. Now, as we already know from the beginning, the inquiry was a setup designed to frame Doc Jamieson, planned years in advance, and literally everyone was in on it. We know this because during a surprise inspection by Danny Ryan and Daryl Kays on Doc Jamieson's property in January of 2006, Danny Ryan informed Doc that his boss, Kerry Watson, had leveraged her connections to the Chiropractors Board of Queensland to come after Doc with a lawsuit, and also that Kerry was planning to instigate a false inquiry against him. Now, at this time, the Chiro Board angle was already underway. Doc later won that case, as we showed in the previous video, and then straight after that was the GRA false inquiry. So even Doc himself realised what the inquiry actually was, but he had to play along for his ultimate goal of exposing the systemic corruption of the industry. Now, while the inquiry as a whole was a mockery of natural justice and a kangaroo court, the first day of the inquiry in particular was an absolute clown world, because every single person involved in the hearing on this day was fully aware that the allegations were completely false and that Doc was innocent. Doc didn't know for sure that this was the inquiry he'd been tipped off about, or what he was going to be up against, until showing up for the hearing. And to complicate things, because the complainant, Danny Ryan, chairman of the stewards, was the person who tipped him off, Doc had to play handicap not being able to directly implicate Danny as one of the major players in the setup, because he was obliged not to after Danny tipped him off. So as we move along, bear in mind that Danny knows that Doc knows that Danny is playing sock puppet to his boss, Kerry Watson. So when things said between Danny and Doc seem a little off, this is why. Knowing that Doc was framed also makes it a lot easier to detect the verbal deception used all throughout the hearing. Even though we don't have audio or video of the hearings and we can't hear the tonal inflections or see the physical body language of everyone attending the hearing, there is still an abundance of the red flags of deceit present all throughout the transcript, which even someone who isn't familiar with detecting the verbal cues of deception could see, in particular with the inquiry chairman, Cameron McClune. To begin with, we have a couple of very stark conflicts of interest. Number 1, Danny Ryan, the chairman of the stewards himself and the highest ranking steward in the GRA, was the complainant. Thus, any internal handling of the inquiry creates a significant conflict of interest. If it was legitimate, the matter should have at least been handled through the Office of Racing or an impartial court, and the only reason it wasn't was so that Doc's reputation, his composure, his finances, and his ability to race could be attacked. Number 2, John Doss, the Bundaberg Racing Club chief steward, was a member of the inquiry panel. However, once his direct involvement in the events that inadvertently led to the allegations was revealed, the inquiry should have been adjourned, with John Doss immediately removed from the inquiry panel. So straight off the bat, we have some major problems with the handling of this inquiry. Doc was never notified of the particulars of the complaint prior to being called into the inquiry. Until showing up for the hearing, he had no knowledge of the details of the complaint, nor was he notified of the witnesses who would be attending. So Doc was never allowed any reasonable or sufficient time at all to prepare his defense. He was completely blindsided. The inquiry chairman's highly biased handling of the inquiry was in and of itself a disgusting display of manipulation, which we'll break down in great detail as we move through this presentation. But in summary, there may have never before been such an abhorrent denial of natural justice as what you're about to see. Incredibly elaborate as they were, the sheer lack of any sound logic or witness credibility made the allegations against Doc extraordinarily preposterous. The allegations were, 1, that Doc had reportedly commented on numerous occasions that he was close friends with the GRA chairman of the stewards, Danny Ryan, and that Danny takes care of his swabs. That is, Danny uses his authority to ensure that during race meetings, Doc's greyhounds are either not swabbed for drug testing, or if they are swabbed, that samples never make it through for processing. Number 2, that Doc had claimed to have been friends for many years with Danny, who was like a father figure to him, and who basically reared him from a young age. Number 3, that Doc had claimed to be having coffee with Danny on a regular, even daily basis. Number 4, that Danny had given Doc authority to spy on the Bundaberg Racing Club, that Danny had told him not to take any flack from anyone and to report back to Danny with anything happening that wasn't in the best interest of the club. And lastly, number 5, that Doc would regularly pretend to be on the phone with Danny around the club as a means to intimidate others. So we'll pick the low-hanging fruit and validate those first. The illogical nature of the second and third allegation would mean that not only would it be completely out of character for a decades-long career professional with a reputation of the most stellar integrity and professionalism, that Doc would have to be of toddler-level intelligence in order to be guilty. Obviously, Doc is a highly intelligent human being, business owner and operator, and Australia-wide well-known animal chiropractic specialist of the highest caliber. So for Doc to claim that a man to which he was several years senior, older than, had reared him from a young age would be asinine, absurd. Equally absurd would be for Doc, while living in Bundaberg, to claim to be having regular, even daily coffee with a man living in Brisbane, 4.5 hours drive away, let alone the absurdity of the GRA chairman of the stewards to be having regular meetings of a personal nature with someone who qualifies as likely the most controversial man in the greyhound racing industry. It would be an outlandish conflict of interest, and making such a claim would inevitably blow up in Doc's face. Just the same as would openly claiming that Danny had given him authority to spy on a racing club. Doc's years of professionalism toward and respect for the GRA stewards was well known. John Doss and Danny Ryan themselves both confirmed in the inquiry just how pristinely clean and respectful Doc's conduct had always been. So again, such a thing would be drastically out of character, as are any of the things Doc is alleged to have said. If he wouldn't say such a thing to people he's known for years, it doesn't make any sense that he would say it to people he barely knows. The fake phone calls to Danny allegation is also invalid, not only because it's out of character, but also because Doc never carried his phone on his person at the races. Numerous witnesses will attest that whenever at the races, Doc would always leave his phone in his car as a matter of principle. Now to address the allegation of Doc having claimed that Danny Ryan looks after Doc's swabs. Throughout all of Doc's racing, his greyhounds were swabbed for drug testing almost every single time. So straight away, the logic required for this allegation to be true is already broken down. Historically, Doc is a pillar of integrity and a very outspoken advocate for animal welfare, vehemently against any use of drugs, live animal baiting, race rigging, or any kind of illegal performance enhancement. The form of Doc's greyhounds was already superior without any of these things, so not only would it be, again, completely out of character for Doc to be openly claiming any kind of special swab privileges, it simply doesn't make any logical sense. It's extremely difficult to frame a man who doesn't do anything wrong, so in order to do so, planned interactions were staged to lay some kind of foundation to frame Doc, paper thin as it was. Now this has already been addressed in the previous video, but to quickly recap, during a race meeting earlier that year in February 2007, Doc's greyhound Winsome Master won its race with a flying time, easily beating all competitors by at least 15 lengths. After the win photo before heading back to the kennel block from the track, Doc said to the chief steward John Doss, "To the swab room," to which John Doss replied, "I was on the phone to Danny Ryan and Danny said, 'What's Doc doing up there with Winsome Master? He's a class dog, don't swab him.'" Then, after leaving the kennel block on his way back to the betting ring, Doc was met by Bill Samuels and Narelle Mulcahy, who were waiting for him at the betting ring entrance. And upon entering, he was questioned by Narelle, who said, "What happened? How come you didn't get swabbed?" So straight away, something doesn't add up. Besides the fact that, by all accounts, with his prior history of terrible form and incredible form that day, Winsome Master should have been swabbed for drug testing, how could Narelle suddenly know that he wasn't? Being well out of earshot from the track and certainly from inside the kennel block, unless she had x-ray vision, there should have been no way for her to know unless she already knew. And with all the subsequent events to date following that incident, the only way she could have known is if she was participating in a plot to open a false inquiry on Doc. Because until the inquiry, that incident was the one and only time that Doc ever mentioned the name Danny Ryan and the word swab in the same sentence.
Up in Bundaberg, when I was getting him ready for the Bundaberg Cup, and I brought him off Eric Haldane, and I got him right, and he had last, and I think, failed the chase. I took him to Bundaberg to give him one look at the track, and then the Bundaberg Cup was in 3 months. So I took him up there, and there was the young guns on. One heat run 32.38, second heat run 32.78. Winston Master, never seen the track before, come out and run 31.78, and I had a big bet on him. In your opinion, Ned, should I have been swabbed?
With that form, yeah.
Absolutely,
yeah.
right? Absolutely, that's what I've said all along. And form reversal, I said to John Doss to the swab room, he says, "No, I was talking to Danny Ryan this morning, and he said, 'What's Doc doing up there with Winston Master? He's a class dog, don't swab him.'" I thought that was a bit unusual because Danny Ryan should have no control over that. So I started to walk back to the swab room, and thinking, I'll get swabbed. I get swabbed every time I'm there. And this time I should have really been swabbed because I had a decent bet and my dog run flying times. 15 lengths quicker than anything of the day, first look. Anyway, he said, no swab. So I walked back up to the kennel block at Bundaberg. So I'm going this way to the kennel block, kennel my dog, walked up the hill, 2 trainers there, Bill and Narelle, which were part players in the setup. Walked up and Narelle goes, "Doc, what happened? How come you never got swabbed?" "I don't know." Asked John Doss. Danny Ryan said, "Don't swab me." That's what Doss said. Now, how would they know I never got swabbed? Because I went straight, after the race, straight to the kennel block. So there, Well, straight away I'm wondering what's going on.
Nonetheless, the twisting of that interaction, along with the elaborate but poorly constructed stories that were told to support it, became the basis for the allegations upon which the inquiry was opened. So could it be that, having nothing legitimate to attack him with, that this was the best scenario the GRA could come up with for laying some kind of foundation with which to frame Doc? Of course it could. In fact, it's the only logical explanation for what happened, given the powerful motives of not only Bill and Narelle, but also the GRA deputy chairperson at the time, Kerry Watson, who had more motive than anyone else in this entire case to bring down Doc Jamieson personally, professionally, and financially. Which brings us to the motives for framing Doc Jamieson. For Bill and Narelle, the motives are very simple and apparent. Doc Jamieson stood in the way of other licensees as the superior trainer, winning almost all the races in which he participated. He basically came out of nowhere and began winning races like some kind of prodigy and taking all the prize money. And this was a massive disruption to the race rigging enterprise at large. Now, because the primary focus of this video was on the initial hearing of the false inquiry, we won't be going into detail about race rigging, greyhound ownership, concealment by stewards, officials and other members of the board, and industry corruption in general. For more details on those subjects, our previous videos are available online at phoenixtaskforce.org. But in essence, Doc Jamieson and the private investigations he'd been conducting ever since entering the industry posed, and still do, an existential threat to a lucrative enterprise of corruption. After being informed by Danny Ryan that he would no longer be allowed onto Queensland racetracks without a licence, Doc reluctantly became a licensee. Reluctant because, as corrupt as it already was, and with his reputation for being a threat to corruption beginning to establish itself, becoming a licensee gave the GRA an avenue through which they could attack him. Once again, the next part has already been detailed in previous videos, but to give a quick summary, shortly after becoming a licensee, Doc held a meeting in 1999 with the highest ranking officials in the GRA, including Danny Ryan, chairman of the stewards, and Peter Cork, the Labor MP and GRA CEO at the time. They tried and failed to bribe Doc because he's incorruptible. Doc told them to clean up the corruption in-house or he was going to go public with all of his evidence to force the issue.
In that meeting with Danny Ryan in 99, well, I went there because about the race fixing and animals being blooded, greyhounds being shot, and all the stewards owning greyhounds in false names rigging races. And Peter Cork, he was the Labor MP, he was there, and Danny went in the room, come back out, talked to me for 15 minutes, went back in talking to him, and then Danny come out to me and says, "Doc, what do you want out of it?" I said, "I don't want any of your dirty money, mate. I want the game cleaned up, and I'm going to make sure it is going to be cleaned up."
So, under the threat of Doc exposing widespread industry corruption, Kerry Watson was the GRA official who not only stood to lose the most, but was also one of the most connected with the power and influence to put a stop to Doc Jamieson. As we've already detailed on previous video, Kerry has connections in the Chiropractors Board, in law enforcement, and even in the CMC, the Crime and Misconduct Commission, which is now the CCC, the Crime and Corruption Commission. We also touched on the connection between Kerry Watson and all the pawns used in framing Doc, in particular with Doc's ex-spouse Rachel Thompson, a saboteur who was planted into his life, and her mother Jocelyn's close friendship with Kerry Watson, and of course Rachel's personal connection with Bill and Narelle. We'll dig much deeper into Kerry Watson and Rachel Thompson in the next video. Now, we already know that the whole inquiry was orchestrated by the GRA from the top down, but to uncover the conspiracy we need to dismantle it from the ground up. So the pawns on the ground level of the first hearing were the witnesses Clive William Bill Samuels, his partner Narelle Mulcahy, and the Bundaberg Greyhound Racing Club secretary Joe Rowe. None of these witnesses have been able to show any credibility at all, and they are all from the Bundaberg Racing Club. And during the first hearing, the only claim of legitimacy the inquiry had rested squarely upon them. In the opening moments of the hearing, Danny claimed, quote, "There is not a club in Queensland that I haven't had a call from a licensee where the view has been made quite clearly by Mr. Jamieson that I'm a close associate of his, a good friend of his, not a club in Queensland." Now, if this were true, surely there would be an abundance of witnesses, but not once throughout the entire hearing was there any direct reference to any other witnesses aside from the three in Bundaberg whose credibility was non-existent. Not only did Bill and Narelle possess clear motive to cause trouble for Doc, their character, as corroborated by at least three witnesses, also speaks to the high likelihood that they had colluded in framing Doc. In the previous video, we showed numerous examples of Bill and Narelle's character, such as the Loaned Kennels drama, where one of Doc's client's parents was subjected to Narelle's very obscene and aggressively offensive language of behaviour, as detailed in the transcript of an SMS to Doc from the client Peter Walmont. The poor sportsmanship, as well as the abusive behaviour of Narelle toward Doc at the Bundaberg racetrack on Cup Day, as witnessed by Matt Green, and the corroboration of Narelle's odious character in the transcript of a conversation between Doc and his ex-spouse Rachel, which incidentally also alludes to Narelle's motive for framing Doc. What we haven't shown yet is the 3.5 pages of transcript of a call between Doc and Joe Rowe, where Joe recounts in detail the trouble caused by Bill and Narelle, as well as verbal abuse she had to tolerate on numerous occasions. Now, along with Bill Norell, Joe is one of the 3 witnesses who gave false testimony in the first hearing. However, while the credibility of her testimony during the inquiry is highly questionable, the likelihood that Joe is being honest and forthcoming in her commentary of Bill and Norell is significantly plausible. In her testimony, Joe supports the allegations that Doc had claimed to be close friends with Danny, that he reported to Danny with regard to happenings and any trouble at the Bundaberg Club, that Doc would pretend to be talking to Danny on the phone, and that Danny takes care of his swabs. Now, regarding informing Danny on happenings at the club, Joe stated that Doc told her this himself, which of course, as we've already shown, doesn't make any logical sense. As for the other 3 allegations, being Danny's close friend, the fake phone calls to Danny, and claiming that Danny takes care of his swabs, Joe maintained that she was only aware of these things through hearsay. She stated that 3 different people had directly told her that Doc was claiming special swab privileges on account of Danny, and she affirmed that it was general knowledge at the club. She also stated that Doc claiming to report to Danny was also common knowledge at the club. But whenever it came to providing specifics about who she had heard this from, Joe could only respond vaguely and was unable to name a single person who told her these things. In Joe's commentary on Bill and Norell, however, she is very forthcoming, recounting a wide range of events in detail, illustrating their deplorable character and the overly negative disposition she has towards them. Here, Joe tells of an instance where Bill and Norell found amusement and laughed at the expense of the breaking down of the greyhound of another trainer. Further along in the same conversation, Joe tells of the ongoing trouble she has with the attitude of Bill and Norell towards her, their derogatory comments about her to other trainers and in general, and the numerous instances where they'd given her a hard time. In those examples, Joe shows no signs of deception, and given the corroboration of Bill and Norell's character by at least 2 other documented witnesses, namely Peter Walmont and Matt Green, Joe is almost certainly telling the truth about her feelings towards them. Using this as a baseline, the telltale cues of Joe's deceit in the inquiry become more apparent, in particular with her tendency to equivocate selectively. Here, Joe is falling over her own words and contradicting herself. This is a classic deceitful red flag. And of course, there is her inability to provide specifics around Doc's alleged claims, with a lot of equivocation going on. The most standout contradiction would have to be that in the inquiry, Joan maintains that there is no infighting at the Bundaberg Club, and she won't affirm that she's ever said anything against Bill and Norell with regard to past conversations with Doc. However, in phone conversation with Doc, she's quite happy to volunteer numerous examples of both. But why would Joe lie with regard to the allegations against Doc? The only reason for Joe to lie that makes any logical sense is that she was under duress. It could have been as simple as the threat of losing her employment or something else the GRA was able to leverage her with. So, given the likelihood that Joe was under duress, the nonsensical nature of Joe's testimony, as well as Joe's negative disposition toward Bill and Norell, looking at this from an impartial viewpoint, Joe is almost certainly lying in the inquiry. Now back to Bill and Norell. So we've established that Bill and Norell had both the motive and the type of character to give false testimony, but with Norell in particular, even beyond the swab scandal, there is a proven tendency to lie and embellish or twist the truth. In one instance, Norell claimed that she wasn't compensated for looking after Doc's dogs. But this is completely untrue, as witnessed by Andrew Wade, who was present for the barter between Doc and Bill and Norell. In Norell's statutory declaration, she claimed that Doc had his dog scratched from a race meeting in Rockhampton earlier that year in February on a fraudulent basis, stating that Doc's car hadn't broken down in Brisbane and that he was still at home in Bargara during the race meeting. But this was a lie. Doc's car was indeed broken down, with the mechanic's invoice and 2 witness statements to back it up. In the same statutory declaration, Norell also claimed that Doc assaulted her with his car on the day of the Bundaberg Cup. Yet another grand embellishment of actual events witnessed by Matt Green, in which Norell all but threw herself in front of Doc's car while kicking at it and yelling abuse. So with this and the commentary by Joe Rowe, it's more than fair to say that Bill and Norell have a sound history of being untruthful troublemakers. Further to their discredit, there's also a major contradiction between the testimony of Norell and Joe. While Joe states that Doc claiming special swab privileges on account of Danny was common knowledge at the club, Norell, a licensee and club regular, claimed that she never heard this from any other licensee and had only heard it from Doc himself. Throughout their testimony in the inquiry, we can see substantial evidence of deceit. Here, Norell is spurting an abundance of superfluous and vague details in an effort to give some kind of logical context and credibility to the lie that follows. In these examples, Norell is thoroughly intent on overemphasizing that she isn't lying. Here, Norell is childishly focused on arguing Doc's failure to be specific in questioning her about correct information instead of just volunteering the correct information like any honest person would. But again, this is just further aligning to her character. As for Bill, the only significant standalone red flag of deception we can see in Bill's testimony is this. However, given the likelihood that the transcript has been altered and the incredibly suspicious plentitude of inaudibles in Bill's testimony, there may well have been many more that have been deliberately obscured. But even without flagging any verbal deception cues, the testimony of Bill and Narelle is already thoroughly discredited by their motive to give false witness testimony, their character strongly supporting the likelihood that they are being untruthful, like Joe's, the nonsensical nature of their testimony, which, if it was true, would be absurdly out of character for Doc, but more importantly because of both the fact that they are still allowed to be racing after being implicated in the killing of 55 greyhounds in 2015, and of course with the threat that Doc poses to the race rigging enterprise at large, of which Racing Queensland is complicit in its facilitation, why it's in the interest of Racing Queensland to protect Bill and Narelle lest they tattle on their collusion with the GRA in the framing of Doc Jamieson. With the knowledge that it was the GRA chairman of the stewards himself, Danny Ryan, who was the informant that tipped off Doc in 2006 about Kerry Watson's plans to attack Doc through the Chiropractors Board of Queensland, as well as with framing him in a false inquiry through the GRA, knowing that, throughout this hearing, the subtext going on between Doc and Danny becomes all the more evident once Doc begins to press that he was being framed. So of course, in the position Danny was in, he had very little recourse but to rely on Doc's honour in being obliged to not implicate Danny in return for cluing Doc in on what was coming. So having been forced by his superior, Kerry Watson, into the position of the complainant, Danny could not work fast enough to put as much distance as he could between himself and the danger of being implicated in the setup. Although Danny does fairly well to conceal his trepidation, his anxious intent to survive the ordeal without being implicated still shines through in his dialogue. Even before Doc makes any mention of being set up, Danny is already doing his best to keep a safe distance from any risk of incrimination. In anticipation, Danny's first major move is to very clearly assert that there is no prior association between himself and the first witness, Bill Samuels. Then when Doc begins to mention his ex-spouse Rachel as a witness and assert that he's being framed by Bill and Narelle, Cameron, the chairman, can't seem to shut down Doc's assertion fast enough and inadvertently puts Danny in peril by attempting to shield Bill with Danny's authority and his inherent assumption of innocence. So undoubtedly starting to feel unsafe, Danny's self-preservation kicks in and he begins to protest against the idea of a setup. Here, the real conversation between the lines of Doc and Danny's dialogue begins to emerge. When the next witness, Joe Rowe, is called in, Danny again immediately takes up a defensive position to establish that there has been no prior history between himself and the witness. By the time the opportunity arrives for Doc to question Joe, Doc has his work cut out for him with no choice but to stay on the offensive while trying his best to avoid injuring Danny in the process. But unfortunately for Danny, the danger of being implicated is getting too close for comfort and he continues to protest Doc's assertions of having been framed. After the final witness has withdrawn and the end of the hearing approaching, Danny is no doubt feeling very exposed and launches into yet another lengthy protest for 3.5 pages of transcript in an attempt to create a safe distance between himself and Doc's primary witness, his ex-spouse Rachel, who isn't even there to testify. Now, despite being on opposite sides of a Cold War between Doc Jamieson and the GRA, which by that point had been ongoing for the better part of a decade, Doc and Danny had always maintained a certain level of professionalism and respect for each other. Reading between the lines of their dialogue, it's not too difficult to see the real conversation going on between these two men, which is most apparent in this section of transcript, where Doc recounts his meeting with Danny and Peter Cork in 1999. On the surface, Doc appears to be simply advocating his character by illustrating his integrity and his respect for the Greyhound Racing Code and the hierarchy of the GRA. But, reading between the lines, Doc is telling Danny that he's never backing down from this fight, and that although he has respect for Danny, if he has to, he'll take down Danny right along with the GRA. Then, in a last-ditch effort to fortify his defences, Danny concludes his discourse with what appears on the surface as a valiant diatribe to absolve himself of any culpability. But again, reading between the lines, this is Danny's reply to Doc, conveying mutual respect and saying that he has no choice but to stand his ground and meet Doc on the battlefield, come what may. Finally, we come to the general overview of the hearing, with a focus on the conduct of the inquiry chairman Cameron McClune, as well as some of the other more notable dialogue and big problems with the handling of proceedings. So in the opening moments of the hearing, we have Cameron raising issues which are completely redundant and serve for nothing more than to paint Doc in a bad light. And there's a lot of this style of conduct throughout the hearing. We already know that it was the GRA's intention for this hearing to be a home run because it was shut down and rebooted a month later with Cameron McClune replaced as the inquiry chairman with Judge Ian Wiley. The primary witness is no longer anywhere to be seen. and a newly procured but equally untrustworthy primary witness put in their place. Obviously, the GRA had to switch up their tactics after the failure of the first hearing. But at least for the first hearing, it was still clearly their intention to end proceedings and shut down Doc as quickly as possible, and again, this is very evident in Cameron's conduct, which was basically doing everything possible to intimidate Doc and make him look like a fool. Even bordering on childish, Cameron's tactics involved constantly interrupting and cutting off Doc, ignoring Doc's valid arguments, attempting to invalidate Doc's arguments with snide remarks, redirecting the narrative, and often just overtly shutting down Doc whenever he attempted to establish a prior history or precedent for his arguments. To kick off the hearing, Cameron wants to do what he calls some housekeeping and brings up the issue of Doc not being able to attend a race meeting in Rockhampton due to a vehicle breakdown and having to scratch his dogs from the race. He then brings in the fact that Doc had to reschedule the first hearing due to commitments to his clients and their animals. Cameron then goes on a diatribe about Doc's obligation to document the reasons for both of these, which he's already done, already provided, and which Cameron has already accepted. Then Cameron requests an explanation from Doc for being an hour and a half late, making an issue out of how long he's had to travel from Brisbane to Bundaberg and how long other people have been waiting for the hearing to start, which Doc explains away with valid reasoning and documentation. Now, the rescheduling is redundant, and the Rockhampton scratching has nothing to do with the inquiry, and the only reason to raise these, it seems, is to add weight to the third issue that Doc is late for the hearing. What Cameron is doing here is trying to weaken Doc's position right off the bat and create a vulnerability he can use later in the hearing, which he does attempt to do. As a side note to this, what we find interesting is the fact that the hearing was being held in Bundaberg instead of the GRA headquarters in Brisbane, where the remaining 3 hearings were held. But with the history of intimidation and harassment that Doc has suffered at the hands of the GRA, we surmise that with the knowledge that Doc was going to be travelling north the very next day for the Mackay and Cairns Cups, and also that he was providing transport for the dogs of another trainer in Brisbane, forcing Doc to travel 4 hours to Bundaberg and 4 hours back to Brisbane, then having to travel another 12 hours to Mackay the next day, was a very effective form of harassment. And then, to make things even more difficult for Doc, the very next day his dogs were scratched from the Mackay Cup race without his knowledge, which led to even more disruption of travel arrangements and the inadvertent death of one of the greyhounds Doc was transporting for his passenger Wayne Andrews. As mentioned previously, we'll go into detail about this in the next video, but for now, this gives a strong impression of the consistent harassment aimed at Doc by the GRA. Here is Cameron's first attempt at breaking Doc's line of defence by shutting down his argument before he even has a chance to make one. Doc attempts to make a completely valid argument to establish a prior history of the attitude and character of the community from which the complaints against him have emerged. This is the statement Doc is referring to, and straight away, Cameron tries to dismiss it. So Doc drops that angle and moves straight into raising the swab scandal, which we detailed earlier, involving John Doss excluding Winsome Master from drug testing, telling Doc that it was on Danny's authority, and Bill and Narelle engaging Doc and prompting him to mention Danny Ryan's name and not being swabbed together in the same conversation, which they took further by twisting it into the main allegation against Doc. This is the moment that John Doss is implicated in Doc's argument that he's being framed. At this moment, John Doss should have been removed from the panel, and with the panel integrity now compromised, the hearing should have been adjourned. But the hearing continues, and from this point onward, and for the next 4 pages of transcript, Cameron and Danny do their level best to keep John Doss from having to explain himself or repeatedly lie about what actually happened that day, because it's clearly a task that John is not competent to perform on his own. Here, Danny moves himself right out in front of the accusation to, in his words, highly refute having spoken on the phone to John about any swabbing of dogs, while being very careful not to say that he did or didn't talk to John on the phone that day. Doc wants to go on a lie detector, and it's all John Doss can do to copy Danny's dialogue and say, "I refute that claim," owing to John's incompetence for lying. Later, Joe Rowe does the same thing because she's also not good at lying. So all Cameron and Danny can do is try to make the matter Doc is raising appear as small and insignificant as possible by redirecting the narrative and, again, keeping the focus on Danny, with the fact that he has no authority to affect the swabbing process and that no such conversation ever took place, which of course aren't Doc's points at all. Doc's point is not so much what John said, but rather why John said it. With nowhere left to run, John has no choice but to face the accusation head-on by admitting to being on the phone to Danny that day, but only saying that it was about another matter altogether. Incidentally, later in a recorded conversation with Doc in 2010, unable to escape the fact that he did indeed say what Doc asserts was said on the track that day, John comes up with the best story he can to try and make Doc question what he nonetheless knows, beyond any shadow of doubt, was actually said.
And then that day when Winston Master got swabbed, and I said to you to the swab room, and you just said, Danny Ryan run the swan and said, "What's Doc Jamieson doing up there with Winston Master? He's a class dog swab, don't swab him." I walked back, I said to the swab room, he said, not swabbing. I walked back. All I done is I said to them, they said to me, how come you never got swabbed? I said, ask John Doss. He said, Danny Ryan rang in this morning and said, don't swab him. I repeated what you said, and then they turned it around and said that I said that Danny Ryan's a mate of mine and he looked after me swabs. John, that's not what I said.
I don't say anything to anyone out here.
What? No, I know what they're like, John. And then you said in the inquiry it didn't, but you know what? I know Danny Ryan's your boss, I understand.
Danny didn't tell me not to swab the dog. Danny said to me, I queried the time, and it wasn't early morning, it was after 8. And Danny Ryan said to me, the dog's quite capable of running that sort of time. It's a good dog.
Right, well John, how come I never got swabbed when I had a big bet on him and he run flying time?
I don't know, I mean, I probably had used all the swab up for the day or something, I don't know.
Well, you've swabbed me every other time, and I don't mind that, mate. You can swab me every time, but, you know, John, even Rachel, the photo lady, was there and heard you say it to me.
Like a dog with a bone, Doc will not let go of the truth of what happened on the track that day, and he starts to bring in Rachel, his ex-spouse, as a witness to what happened. And Cameron can't seem to get off the subject soon enough, anything to keep the focus away from John's credibility or that of the panel coming into focus. Here, Cameron overtly tries to pull focus right off John and straight back to the allegations against Doc, but Doc continues dismantling their logic to expose their absurdity and steer the narrative back onto the accusation against John. Danny again stands right out in front of it and takes another stab at discrediting Doc by attacking the only point he can, the fact that he has no authority over the swapping process, which doesn't even weigh in on Doc's argument. So this of course falls apart until finally, the only question left is, why would John Doss say such a thing? To validate his argument, John again brings up his ex-spouse Rachel as a witness. At this point, the only thing Danny and Cameron could do was play dumb. Now, they both know exactly which Rachel Doc is talking about, but for their own self-preservation, they need to distance themselves from her as much as possible. Being Danny and Cameron's boss, best friends with Rachel's mother Jocelyn, and the mastermind behind the setup and framing of Doc, Kerry Watson was the one connecting everyone together, directing the entire charade from behind the scenes. Originally, before starting to jump back and forth over the fence between Doc and the GRA setup crew, Rachel was planted into Doc's life to sabotage his anti-corruption work and burn his evidence. Being in the days before everyone had a smartphone in their pocket, Rachel kept handwritten notes, which she later gave to Doc as evidence during a time when she was still siding with him. And as you can see, Rachel was directly involved in setting up Doc in the first place, colluding with both Danny and Cameron through Kerry. And it was actually Rachel who replaced Bill and Narelle as the primary false witness of the inquiry after it was rebooted and moved to Brisbane. So this direct connection is why Danny and Cameron had to play dumb when her name came up in the inquiry. So Doc calls them out on their feigned ignorance, and in what is now becoming a pattern of behaviour, Cameron shuts down that line of dialogue and pulls focus straight back to the allegations against Doc. Moving forward to page 17, in his defence with regard to his car being scratched on a regular basis, Doc is attempting to establish a prior history for the attitude of the Bundaberg Racing Club community towards him, as indicative of the motive to frame him. And again, all Cameron can do is quite unambiguously shut down that line of dialogue and keep bringing the conversation back to focus squarely on the allegations, as if they are the only things that matter and by themselves carry all the credibility needed to incriminate Doc. On the next page, Cameron is fighting a losing battle and resorts to snide remarks to try and level the playing field and leverage a better position, stating the obvious as if Doc is somehow being ignorant. A little further along, Cameron makes the mistake of trying to diminish Doc's valid argument regarding having his car being scratched, which just opens the door for Doc to finish making his argument. Cameron continues to make light of it, and the moment Doc brings up evidence, Cameron blatantly ignores it and moves straight ahead to call in the first witness, Bill Samuels. Here, Cameron doesn't appear to understand what a leading question is, but he calls Doc out on it anyway, only to have Bill answer Doc's question with another question. It should be noted at this point that almost all of Danny's questions to the witnesses, particularly Joe Rowe and Narelle Mulcahy, have been leading questions, but Cameron hasn't pulled him up on any of them. Then, when Doc tries to get specifics out of Bill, Cameron interjects and speaks on behalf of Bill so that he doesn't have to answer the question properly. Bill still takes the opportunity to throw in a couple of snide remarks anyway. 2 more pages on, Cameron asks Doc directly why Bill would be lying, but when Doc begins to answer the question, Cameron once again shuts it down, this time labelling it as hearsay, which is ironic, as hearsay is basically all there is on the opposing side as well. This here is unprofessional and unnecessary unless it's meant to cause frustration. Here Doc is becoming frustrated, and Cameron takes opportunity to rub it in with a subtle reprimand, throwing back to the start of the hearing and bringing up again the late start and how everyone has been waiting for Doc to arrive. Here, once again, Doc is trying to establish prior history to back up his argument, and again, Cameron is shutting it down before Doc has a chance to finish stating his case. Then, as if Doc has been able to have any real opportunity to state his case, Cameron leaves a mock opening to question Bill further, but by this point, Doc has realised that there is no point, because Cameron is obviously just going to keep shutting him down. Here, Bill has obviously made some kind of conveniently inaudible remark to Doc as he's leaving the room. Doc responds, but instead of reprimanding Bill, who's been dismissed, Cameron rebukes Doc. So by now, Cameron's strategy of trying to get Doc upset is having an effect. Cameron offers Doc a short adjournment to cool down, which Doc tries to accept, having had the welfare of his dogs on his mind for the entire hearing so far. Doc's greyhound still hadn't had a chance to toilet yet after a long trip from Brisbane, and being the man he is, at the mention of taking a break, this was his first priority. He probably shouldn't have mentioned this, however, because with apparently no concern for animal welfare, which is appalling for an official of an organisation centred around animals, Cameron withdraws his offer for an adjournment, holding it up like a carrot, only willing to grant it on the condition that it's for Doc to regain his composure, with apparently no consideration whatsoever for the dogs. After the adjournment, Cameron launches into an admonition to blame Doc for his own frustration, as if Doc didn't have any right to be frustrated, showing up to an inquiry about a complaint for which he'd received no details of the complaint, no notification of who'd be attending as witnesses, no opportunity to prepare a defense, and the knowledge that he has yet another 16 hours of driving to do in the next 24 hours, is all perfectly logical and valid reason for Doc to be frustrated, but of course, this was again simply another move to weaken Doc's position. Cameron's lack of professionalism shines through here as he requests for a witness to speculate. By this point, Cameron has shut down Doc so many times now that it's just par for the course. Despite that Doc has already provided sound logical reasoning for why Bill and Narelle are being untruthful, Cameron asks the question again, only to completely disregard Doc's answer and side with Bill and Narelle in a plainly biased manner. By now, Cameron's bias is quite blatant as he maintains a stubborn ignorance of Doc's repeated assertions of rigorous logical reasoning. At this point, tempers are flaring and Cameron is having difficulty maintaining a civil hearing. This far into the hearing, the monotony of Cameron's unmitigated and biased dismissal of any of Doc's arguments are basically narcissistic. Without much else to throw at Doc, here Cameron is engaging in semantics just for the sake of antagonism. At this point in the video, continually pointing out Cameron's outright dismissals of anything Doc wants to argue is becoming extremely tedious, but it just goes to show what a blatant kangaroo court this was. So hang in there, we're almost at the end now. More of the same, although Cameron appears to be running out of dismissive vocabulary here because Doc was certainly asking questions. Here is some more unnecessary and unprofessional sarcasm. This is just tit for tat. Any angst that Doc has toward Bill and Narelle bears no weight toward any guilt he would otherwise have if this was actually a legitimate inquiry and not a setup. And besides, Doc has documented proof of the fallout between himself and Bill and Narelle, but again, this is just Cameron being dismissive. And yet again, and finally, Cameron one last time, shutting down Doc's attempts to get specifics out of a witness and potentially exposing a lie. Now, after all of these shenanigans, Cameron very clearly either has some kind of personal vendetta against Doc, or he is actively participating in framing Doc, because he's working as diligently as possible to steer the narrative of inquiry proceedings in favour of the complaint. This hearing was such a circus that it's really no wonder the GRA decided to invalidate it, reboot the inquiry and move it to Brisbane a month later. As you've now seen, it was so blatantly obvious that this was a setup that the GRA would never release a copy of the audio to Doc. They did release the transcript, but as you've seen, there is an abundance of inaudibles throughout the transcript. 91 in total, many of those showing up in locations where it appears that critical information is very likely being spoken. Doc has since received advice from an ex-GRA steward, Bob Watkins, that it was common practice for audio tapes to go missing and for transcripts to be typed up as inaudible. Here, Doc is talking about a client, but its omission makes it appear that Doc may not have a legitimate reason for showing up late to the hearing. Here, Danny is alluding to the allegation of Doc claiming that Danny was like a father to him, and its omission takes away from the absurdity of the allegation. Is this person's name important? Here, Doc is giving his version of what happened in his conversation with John Doss on the track at Bundaberg, which is obviously critical to the inquiry. This one breaks the coherence of this section of dialogue entirely. This could be critical to supporting Doc's arguments. What's Doc saying here could be important. So could this. And this. There are so many inaudibles in Bill Samuel's testimony that he could possibly have some kind of speech problem, but with so many of these, there's no telling how much critical information could be missing here weighing in Doc's favour. What's Doc saying here? And here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here in particular. And the list goes on and on and on. As you would have seen if you have viewed any of the previous videos we've released with Doc speaking, his speech is quite loud and clear, so the number of legitimate inaudibles in the transcript is questionable at best. And considering the nature of the inquiry being a setup, the difficulty Doc experienced in obtaining a copy of the transcript, the GRA failing to provide audio tapes of the inquiry, Bob Watkins' advice on the regularity of audio tapes going missing, and just how incriminating this hearing is for the GRA, the transcript has almost certainly been altered. So, in conclusion, the abundance of logic evidenced in pointing out the theatre of this hearing shows quite discernibly just how obvious a frame job this was, and just how desperately the GRA needed to shut Doc down. Because that's how much of a threat the evidence Doc holds poses to the corruption within the industry. Because the exposure of such corruption would unleash a shockwave of systemic reform, starting within Racing Queensland and rippling out through the entire greyhound racing industry and beyond, all the way up through to the highest levels of government. So if you who are watching this right now, have received this video as part of an evidence package submission, and you're someone who has the power to launch an investigation, you need to take action. Don't fob this off as something outside of the scope of your department or the responsibility of some other office or not in the public interest. Exposing of the race rigging enterprise at large, the widespread animal cruelty and murder of greyhounds that it facilitates, and the systemic corruption covering it up is in the public interest. It's in your interest. And after more than 16 years of being covered up, it's about time Doc had his name cleared. Don't be one of the apathetic departments who sat on this and did nothing. Do the right thing. If you're a member of the public or the honest greyhound racing community, go to phoenixtaskforce.org and sign the petition to help us expose this corruption, clean up and reform the industry, and stop the needless killing of the animals and the greyhounds. In the next video, we'll continue exposing the truth as we wrap up this breakdown of the false inquiry on Doc Jamieson. Thanks for watching. God bless.